Hello and welcome to the Alliance for Democracy's The Populist Dialogues. Our program promotes progressive, populist perspectives on the issues of the day. The Alliance for Democracy is dedicated to establishing true democracy and creating a just society based on an equitable, sustainable economy. Our guest today is Greg Burrill, a peace activist, entrepreneur, and an educator, currently teaching in the Portland Public Schools. Greg is active in his union, the Portland Association of Teachers, the Oregon Education Association, and the National Education Association. He serves on a number of committees of the Portland Association of Teachers. As if that wasn't enough, Greg also has a consulting company, Mindful Education's Next Direction. So welcome to our program, Greg.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So we obviously want to talk about education today, and specifically about Portland Public Schools. Portland Public Schools is underfunded, as well as most of the education system, certainly in Oregon and probably most of the nation, at least the public systems. Yet, some decades ago, Portland was kind of a model nationally for what schools should look like. What's happened?
You know, David, it's amazing. I didn't live back in Oregon in the 80s, but Lou Frederick, for example, was an educator back in those days, our state senator. And he told me that we used to produce curricula here, and other school districts around the country would buy them. We had all sorts of teaching tools that were available, and our schools were among the best in the nation.
Okay, and any idea what happened?
Yeah, in a word, Measure 5, Measure 47, Measure 50. Basically what happened was the citizens passed Measure 5 in 1990, and that capped property taxes and ended property taxes as a vehicle to fund education. Back before Measure 5, urban schools were really well funded because they had lots of expensive properties, and rural schools in Oregon were underfunded. And so this was an attempt to make the balance between rural and urban education a little better. Unfortunately, the legislature has never fully funded public schools at the rate that they need to be.
Okay. As I recall at the time, when those measures passed, the argument was primarily about not wanting to pay so much. It was part of the whole tax revolt that kind of swept the whole nation. And you presented it as being a way to help fund rural schools, but I don't recall that argument at all.
Well, it's more a consequence. I remember I didn't live here then, so right, you actually lived through the campaign.
Yes, I did, yeah.
What I know is that whole tax revolt stuff. We are now in a situation where we don't look at what we need to spend. We look at how much money there is and decide what we can do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And did any of these measures set standards for how schools, how much schools should be able to spend, or did they establish any kind of quality measurements?
Well, actually, the Oregon does have what's called the quality education model, and that came quite a few years. Measure 5 was enacted in 1990, but Measure 47, which was a further reduction of taxing authority, it was passed in 1997. And so the legislature decided that they had better look and come up with some sort of quantitative measure of what an adequate education would look like and how much it would cost. So they started a committee in 1997, and I believe the first draft of the quality education model was published in 2002.
Okay. I personally have never heard of this concept. So, and of course, yeah, I don't have any children in school, so I don't pay as much attention as I probably should. But this quality education model, never heard of it.
Yeah, well, it sets goals for how many teachers there should be, how many subjects should be taught. But of course, it doesn't say what's necessary. It just says, well, how about this? I encourage everybody to Google the quality education model. It's a 48-page report, and it's fairly readable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, great. And so measures 5, 47, and 50, there were 3 measures, and the main effect was to take the funding of schools out of the local and make it the responsibility of the state.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. All right. And the consequence of that is that most schools, public schools in the state of Oregon, are underfunded.
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to say that that's all the legislature's fault. They did figure out what adequate education would cost. They've never been able to adequately tax Oregonians to pay for it. And one of the most important reasons is that in the same time that the state has been responsible for funding public schools, the share of taxes paid by corporations has gone from a little over 18% to a little under 7%. Mm-hmm. And so Oregonians are now more heavily taxed than residents of many other states, yet we have the third largest class sizes in the nation. We have one of the lowest graduation rates. I don't cite a specific figure because different states calculate graduation rates different ways. And so I don't want to do an apples to orange comparison. Mm-hmm. But our schools, only about 3/4 of students graduate from schools in Oregon.
Which is outrageous. I may have this figure wrong, but I think that when I graduated from high school, it was probably 90%, or maybe even higher than that graduated on time from high school in Oregon, and it's phenomenal to me that you have that kind of slippage.
And by the way, you're mentioning of graduating on time. That's one of the ways that many states fudge their graduation rates. There's a 4-year graduation rate, there's a 5-year graduation rate, there's a 6-year graduation rate. And so different, for example, I began my teaching career in Baltimore, Maryland, at a school where 1,000 ninth graders would start school every year, 300 12th graders would graduate every June. And one of their big political footballs was keeping the dropout rate under 20%. You do the math.
Yeah. Just the idea that your goal would be to keep the dropout rate under 20%, as if 20% were acceptable, or 19 or 18.
Even though 2/3 of the kids that started in the 9th grade didn't finish the 12th grade.
Yeah, right. Well, okay, all right. So Oregon schools are underfunded.
Quite a bit.
And this quality education model, does it establish some dollar figures?
Yes, and it's recalculated for every biennium. In the 2015-16 biennium, the quality education model said that we should have spent $9.4 billion on our schools, and the legislature funded $7.36 billion. So okay. That's about a $2 billion spread.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And this last year, they did better than they have?
Well, I didn't figure it out as a ratio. The 2017-18 QEM figure was $9.8 billion, and we funded $8.2 billion.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, okay, so inadequate. So Give us an idea of what's included in this model. What are the expectations that schools would do?
Well, in general, it's about the teacher-pupil ratio, so how many kids in a class, how many different courses each teacher would have to prepare. It assumes that every kid is entitled to physical education, music, both band and chorus. Let's see, an adequate supply of education professionals, speech pathologists, counselors, psychologists, enough special ed support so that all the kids with specific learning disabilities have an appropriate setting for their education, that medically fragile students have adequate nursing care. The list is pretty long, that all schools have librarians.
Yeah, okay. And so many schools don't meet certainly most schools don't meet all of the requirements. Many of them don't meet many of the requirements.
Yeah, with 191 school districts in Oregon, I'm not going to comment on that globally, but there aren't any schools in Portland Public Schools that are able to offer all that the quality education model mandates.
Okay, and so it does mandate per school, not per district.
Per pupil.
Per pupil. Okay. So we passed these measures 5, 47, and 50. And 50 was just a slight modification of 47. Is that right?
Yeah, 50 was referred to the voters by the legislature because of problems in the language of Measure 47.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So generally we hear about 5 and 50 and we don't hear about 47 anymore.
Right,
okay.
Right. Because 47 never really took effect. It was modified by the legislature.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So talk about the consequences of the underfunding, but both for the student and for the schools themselves.
Well, let me start with the schools, because every middle school in Portland used to have daily physical education, music, fine art, as well as band and orchestra, drama, and these programs have been cut one by one. The number of electives you can take at some schools is drastically reduced. And then at the per pupil level, one of the reasons I work as a substitute teacher, I'm licensed as a French teacher, and if I had a full-time job in Portland Public Schools, I would be required to teach 5 levels of French, first year through 5th year, to teach 4th and 5th in the same classroom. So I'd be preparing 5 lessons, and I would have 180 students to grade. And Portland is lucky in that our pupil load is capped at 180. When I subbed at David Douglas, did a long-term job, I had 207 students that I was teaching. So with 180, if I spend 10 minutes per student per week assessing their ability to read, write, speak, and understand spoken French, that would take 30 hours. And by contract, I'm paid to teach 37 and a half hours. And of course, there's 25, 26 hours of classroom instruction a week, and there's the time it takes to prepare 5 separate lessons.
Pretty impossible.
Right, and my hat's off to all the teachers that are doing their best to satisfy these needs. They're leaving things out, and I didn't want to be. I didn't want to fall that far short of the mark of what I think a good education is.
Okay. All right. Wow. Okay. Talk about what an ideal education system looks like.
Okay. Well, first of all, the first thing I want to say about an ideal education is it wouldn't necessarily involve much of what we think of as school. Human beings have been highly evolved to figure out what it is they need to learn, figure out how to learn it, test their own self-mastery and stop working on it when they've achieved the goal. For example, we all learn to speak our native language. Nobody needs to teach it to us. On the other hand, we aren't naturally evolved to read and write. So we have to be taught how to read and write. I say that and I'm going to contradict myself. I don't know if you heard, but there was an experiment a few years ago where they set up computers in kiosks in slums around the world, and with no instructions, kids were able to figure out how to log onto those computers, learn to read English, and learn to satisfy their needs without any instruction whatsoever.
So is there just a natural curiosity that motivates?
We can call it natural curiosity, but as a philosopher dealing with human nature, I would say that we are evolved to learn in certain ways.
Okay, all right, yeah. So talk more about that ideal school.
Okay. Well, for example, I'm writing a novel of speculative fiction, and I assume in my novel that we've figured out how to live sustainably. And the way I introduce our current way of life is through the eyes of a precocious child who is doing history research. And so she is choosing the subjects that she wants to research, but elsewhere in the book I show that kids learn by basically doing field trips. For example, kindergartners will have a function in a bank to just count things. They count money, they count people that come in, and so they learn to count from doing jobs for the bank. Older kids will learn to add and subtract for deposits and withdrawals. Kids that are still older will do the compounding interest equations. And so the kids get to experience adult jobs, and they learn by doing the jobs.
Okay, yeah, I recall, except I can't recall, when I was a kid and in school that there was some classes that were more book learning, and there were other classes that were more practical, and just for that difference in how kids learn.
Yeah, well, to just give you an example of how kids learn, one way that you can determine how a kid learns is to just give them a box with a toy that they'd really like to play with that needs to be assembled. And you'll find that some kids will start by lining up all the parts so they can see them. Some kids will start by reading the instructions. Some kids will just start taking parts and putting them together to see how they fit. And these represent different ideas about learning and organizing the knowledge.
Yeah. I also remember as a kid, I have a twin brother, and when we were given something, I always remember that I would try to put it together or figure out or whatever, and my brother would always say, "No, I can't do that." And I was like, we were always encouraging him to say, "Yes, I can do that." And he was always, "No, I can't do that." "You can do that, but I can't do that."
Right.
So totally different. And twin brothers, so we should be, reasonably alike.
Yeah, we were identical twins?
Identical twins, yeah.
I'm going to put that in my research.
Okay, all right, good. Yeah. So you have written about South Korea and Finland schools, and both of which rate much better than American schools. So talk about those two school systems.
Okay, and well, first of all, there's been a lot of talk about schools in Finland lately, and they're aware of it, so they actually charge people to come and look at their system and see how they do it. What's great about Finland is that they have decided to hire teachers they really trust. and turn them loose to educate children in the way they think best. There are no standardized tests. Children spend less time in the classroom than they do here in the United States, and everybody's happier. If you were to go to a school in Finland right now, it would look a lot like an American school, except for one thing. The teachers in the teachers' lounge would be relaxed. They would look very satisfied with their jobs. They wouldn't be worried about whether or not they could finish their lunch in the minutes allowed to eat. Mm-hmm. So in order to be a teacher in Finland, it's harder to get into the School of Education than it is to get into the School of Medicine or the School of Law. You cannot even apply unless you have a recommendation from your undergraduate teacher.
So they really recommend. I mean,
yes.
they really value teaching.
And they train them for 5 years before they're ever allowed to be in control of their own classroom, and they pay them throughout that time, so it's a sustainable career. And finally, they encourage the teachers to do research in their own classrooms to find out the best way of educating their own children given their particular personalities and interests. So teachers have different ways of interacting with students, just as each student has a different way of interacting with teachers.
Yeah, and of course in America, it's all about teaching to the test.
Right. Well, luckily, it's less about teaching to the test. There's been quite a bit of pushback on testing in Oregon. And one thing that I'd like to mention is there's a partnership between the Oregon Department of Education and the Oregon Education Association, our state teachers union, to come up with assessments that are reliable enough so that no one can charge that the teacher is inflating scores to make him or herself look better. And we already know that teacher-driven assessments that relate to the material learned in the classroom are better predictors of kids' college readiness than standardized tests.
Okay, all right. And so you talked about Finland, talk about South Korea.
South Korea is instructive. They get better results than we do, but by stealing children's entire childhoods. There's a book that maybe some of your viewers would like called The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way. And it talks about in South Korea, after the kids finish their day in high school, they go to night school for more school. And in Korea, there's a law that high school kids cannot be in school after midnight. And the police department in Seoul has a whole squad dedicated to busting schools that are teaching later than midnight.
That's hard to wrap my head around.
Well,
Right.
I want you to understand that the reason that I'm so against our model of teaching to the test and so forth isn't that it can't work. It's that it's not necessary to steal kids' teenagerhoods in order to have good outcomes in school.
Yeah, right. So if you would recommend that American schools model themselves after another school system, then Finland would be your ideal model.
Yeah, but I can't say anything quite that simplistic.
Yeah.
First of all, the Finnish language is much more phonetically spelled than English. So in American schools, we have a dyslexia rate perhaps 20%. In Finland, the dyslexia rate is 5% because the kids don't have nearly so much to learn about different ways of spelling the same sounds.
Oh, yeah. That's something I would never have particularly thought about. Yeah.
It's amazing how much teachers know about how to teach kids, and it's amazing how little respect we get for that amazing knowledge that we possess.
Yeah. So talk for a few minutes about your involvement with the union.
Okay, and I have to say as a disclaimer that I cannot speak for the union.
No, but your involvement with them.
Well, I guess I began by being on the substitute teacher committee because there are only 3 groups of substitute teachers in the state of Oregon that are represented by a union. I felt like it was a great privilege to be able to volunteer with the union. I actually believe that in a country with separation of church and state, the only institution that can oppose the corporatocracy is the union. So therefore, it's very important to me to be active and to support my union.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right.
So from the substitute teacher committee, all union business is done by consent of the teachers. So as a substitute teacher, I serve in the Portland Association of Teachers Representative Assembly. So we decide what programs we're going to champion in the union. At the state level, we do the same thing. And this past summer, for the first time, I was a delegate to the National Education Association. And there, 8,000 teachers and 166 new business items, we just decided what we were going to spend our dues money on.
Mm-hmm. All right, great, great. So we've got actually about 45 seconds, a last passing final thought.
Well, I guess the reason that I do all that I do is because I am an optimist. I believe that we are going to learn how to effectively educate our students, and I believe that we are going to avoid overshoot and dieback. Extinction would be the worst case scenario caused by the way we misuse our natural resources and we have a system where 1% of the human beings on this planet control 99% of the wealth, and I don't even think that's good for the wealthy.
No, true. Yeah. So perfect timing. Thank you very much for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation.
All right, thank you, David.
All right, great. Yeah. So we've been talking with educator and peace activist Greg Burrell. To learn more about his thoughts on education, visit his blog, Education versus Schools, at educationvschool.wordpress.com. Have you missed one of our programs? Want to watch something again or suggest a friend watch something? Well, you can do that all now because all our programs are saved to our webpage. Visit www.populistdialogues.org to view past programs, or when viewing a program to sign up for our YouTube Populist Dialogues channel to receive a notification when a new program is added. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next week. Bye.